I'm really pleased to present Natalia Aleksiun, and if everybody else could make sure they're muted, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. And if you can disable the disabling thing, because I want to share the screen with my presentation. Paul, I don't hear you, but I'm not able to show my presentation. Ah, great. Now it's working. So I'm truly honored to be part of your morning and possibly early afternoon. And thank you so much to Paul and to Elizabeth for the invitation and for a chance to talk about something that is very much on my mind.
Natalia,
as the last moment after the Holocaust. Yes,
Natalia, it's Liz.
Yes, yes.
Because there isn't a little bit of an issue with your connection, can you turn off your video? I think your audio will then work better. Now I can't hear you. Now I hear you, but make sure to stop your video if you can. Perfect. Oh, I see, but then that changed your, you can't screen share that way. All right, we'll do the best we can. I'm very sorry, try it again.
Yeah, Natalia, you should turn your video back on. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
And
well,
you should screen share so we can see it.
I have shared the screen, but is it not shared?
Do it again if you would.
Yes. Well,
oh, there it goes.
Perfect, it's coming. I apologize for the confusion.
Speaking speaking person, definitely I miss speaking in person about Jewish history and in general. So I want to start with this image of Esther Strmer, one of the surviving families that I have followed, author of a fantastically interesting and rich diary memoir, written originally in Yiddish and translated into English. You might want to look it up. There is also a documentary released in 2013 about this remarkable story of survival. But what's remarkable is not only the fact that Esther Strmer survived hiding in caves in what is today Western Ukraine, and was known to the survivors themselves as Galicia, Eastern Galicia, part of Austro-Hungarian Empire for 150 years, and then part of the Second Polish Republic, is what you see. What's remarkable is what you see in the picture. That is a multi-generational family. Esther Strmer was a grandmother and a mother, and she went into the caves with her children and her grandchildren. And so this is not a family that reunited in the DP camps. This is not a family that reunited on the shores of America or in Palestine, but this is how they emerged from hiding in the summer of 1941. But this story is remarkably different from a vast majority of stories of survivors or experiences of survivors who came out of hiding or returned from labor camps or forests or partisan units in the summer of 1944 and throughout the first half of 1945. It very much depends where you were at the time. The timing of your liberation would depend on it. So in Ukraine, this was spring and summer of 44, which is when people were still deported to Auschwitz from Łódź and from Hungary, and then later on in central and western Poland. So as survivors were returning to their hometowns, or simply realizing that the war for them was over if they were liberated in labor camps and concentration camps, the fate of their families. And they seem to all be torn between two poles. On the one hand, hope, and on the other hand, a sense that this hope is probably futile. What I found remarkable in many accounts is that the survivors who knew that the chances of their family, of their parents, of their siblings, of their children surviving based on when and how, what were the circumstances that they had last seen them, were very slim. Upon liberation, they very much hope that somehow someone might have made it. And so they are trying to generate situations in which they can find or give fate a chance in a family reunited. And so in the first weeks and months, what we have primarily are individual desperate efforts to locate family members. This is one of the main reasons why survivors return to their hometowns if this is not where they survived. Sometimes walk there, sometimes hitchhike. This is often accompanied by a great physical danger to their lives, given the rampant anti-Semitism and lawlessness. But a lot of the families seem to have an arrangement that they made upon parting that if anyone survives, they should meet at the address of the family before the war, or at the parents' home. So people are trying to make it there, hoping that someone will be waiting for them there. So just one example, a memoir that I've been reading in over the last few days, written by Ruszka Rosette Faust Halpern. You see on the left a picture of her family before the war with all her siblings. She's this cute little girl in the middle. She was the youngest. Two brothers emigrated to America before the war. So the two handsome men that you see in the picture, Jack and Leon, I suspect that Jack was Yitzhak before he became Jack. So Jack and Leon, she knew, were living in America, and in fact, her later decisions, whether or not to rebuild her life in Israel or in America, were also based on a desire to reunite with a remaining family. So she decided to go to America primarily because she wanted to be with her brothers. But she didn't know what happened with the rest of the siblings and her parents. And so one of the first things she did after she recovered physically, she was in a very fragile state after starving in a hiding place in the attic on her own. After she got a little physically better, as you see here from the fragment of her memoir, she walked accompanied by a young boy. I suspect that this is also to have a witness, to be a little safer on this hiking to the town where her sister Berta lived. And in her case, this was a happy surprise, or her hope was fulfilled because her sister, in fact, did survive together with children and her husband. So you have this subdued somewhat description of hugging and crying together and telling stories and exchanging news of what happened, because Ruszka did not know the circumstances of her parents' death, her sister did. And another example, I know probably not many of you read Polish, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how physically, materially, some of these accounts look like. Here is a testimony given by Gina Mar in 1952, so it's a very early testimony about her survival in hiding. And a picture that is part of what she gave to Yad Vashem is a tragic picture. That's a picture of her only child that was murdered. She knew that her daughter was not alive, but she was part of the large family. And as she was returning to Lvov, very sickly, very fragile, very physically challenged, the whole trip from where she was hiding back to Lvov was a great difficulty for her. But she is in this fragment that you see here. She's trying to convince herself that her sisters might be alive, because her sisters had many friends among Catholic Poles. So in her mind, there was a logical chance that one or two of her sisters were able to find someone that would be willing to offer them shelter, and that she might find them in Lvov. She did not. Upon arrival there, she discovered no one from her family survived. There are also complicated stories in that time in which there are no lists, no agencies that collect and make those lists of survivors available. So people base their assumption on probability. And you have here a picture of Abram Gruber with his wife and a child. The wife and the child were killed, and he helped to rescue another woman with her child, the woman whose husband was drafted to the Russian army in the summer of 1941, and the woman who received testimonies of people from the same unit in which her husband was fighting, that he in fact was killed. So she thought of her return. And so you have a great degree of uncertainty, and it makes attempts of rebuilding life, rebuilding families, starting new families very difficult, because people don't know whether their spouses survived, whether their children might be coming back. And so one of the most important aspects of the institutional effort that survivors create themselves to help themselves in what is most at stake for them in that post-war period is a search for family members. And in a picture here, you see this bearded man is the chairman of an interesting organization that operated in Poland, as you can see, between 1944 and 1949. It was an official political representation of Polish Jewry, a community that went from 3.5 million Jews before the war to, well, how many, this is a question and a very political question, how many Polish Jews survived? Possibly under the German occupation, the numbers range anywhere between 60 to 100,000. But the Central Committee of the Jews in Poland, when it first constituted itself in the fall of 1944, the help to search survivors, to search for family members, and Emil Sommerstein, a pre-war lawyer and Zionist, who ended up actually coming to the US on a fundraising mission to collect money for the needs of the surviving Polish Jewry. and suffered a stroke and never returned to Poland. Here you have him actually on the site of what was Warsaw Ghetto. So the rubble behind him are the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto. And one of the men that is in the group is the one with mustaches, Marek Edelman, the leader of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the surviving leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So the Central Committee of Jews in Poland created a registration mechanism and registration apparatus in which this Department of Statistics had committees in all towns and cities where a number of Polish Jews came together, and they would be then sending those cards to the Central Committee in Warsaw that in the end put together a cardex, an index of all surviving Polish Jews with some 280,000 cards. Now, it does not number of survivors because people searching for family members often registered multiple times. So some of these cards are not just representing one individual person, but just to give you a sense of how it looked like, here's a card of Abraham Abend, a man born in 1889, and it gives you change of addresses during the war, the address before the war, but the most important aspect for a family member that might be looking for Abram was his current address. So he was at the time, he was a shoemaker, and at the time of the registration in 1946, in the spring of 1946, he resided at Piłsudskiego 22 Street in Łódź. Another card, and you can see there are, for historians, this is a frustrating material because the cards had space for a lot of information to reconstruct history of this individual during and after the war. But most of these cards are only partially filled because what really mattered, again, is this current address, where they are today. This is where a family can find me. Another aspect of this registration that was carried out by the Central Committee of Polish Jews that for families was especially important was the registration of children that were found, that were recovered, that wandered by themselves to Jewish institutions. And I have seen multiple accounts of young children who survived on their own, especially in a Polish countryside. Many of them didn't realize that they were not the only survivors. They assumed that they're the last Jews. And when they, by the word of mouth, or because they had seen a newspaper, or because someone visited the village, when they were hearing that in fact there are other Jews in a nearby city, or in Łódź, or in Warsaw, some of them would make that fateful decision to leave the place where they were during the war and present themselves to Jewish institutions. So this is not a return to a family. In most cases, they were returning to contact with the Jewish institution. And then those Jewish institutions would create information available for family members, both in Poland and especially abroad, to try to and locate their children. So you have pictures, you have description of character, whatever the children remember of their life before and during the war. Some of these children were too young to remember their own name. before they took on a Christian name as a way to pass and survive during the Nazi occupation. So pictures were important because family members.
I'm sorry, everyone. It looks like we had a technical issue with the connection. We'll get back as soon as we can.
Hello? Hello?
Thank you, Natalia. You're back. Can you share your screen once more?
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes. How did you see it now?
Perfect.
So assuming that I was cut off in the middle of the sentence, so you see on the left side a page with a list of Jews from a particular town who had lived in this particular town together by a Landsmannschaft, which is an organization of Jews coming, stemming from a particular town or city. They had branches abroad, and so they were interested in knowing who of the Jews living in this town had survived and registered themselves. And so family members could nervously look at the list and see if maybe someone from their dear ones was able to survive and to register. Speaking about international organizations, so Landsmannschaften were those unions of Jews from the same locale, were very important for people, both notifying family members abroad and family members abroad being able to know that someone did survive. Another are organizations of Polish Jewry. Again, this is the largest European Jewish community before the Holocaust. So here you have an envelope sent to the Jewish Organization of Polish Jewry in Sweden, in Stockholm. Much of this correspondence pertained to whether or not such and such person can be found in Sweden, because someone heard that this and that person was evacuated to Sweden. So a correspondence that goes out of Jewish organizations to other Jewish organizations out of Poland and to the International Red Cross.
Sorry, everyone, connection issues again. While we're waiting for Natalia to come back, I'm going to turn the video off for everyone. I think it's unlikely to make a difference, but I'll try it anyway.
Yes, so another way in which people are finding their relatives are Winkel for the family, or special corners in newspapers published in Poland, Jewish newspapers in which people would announce themselves to be alive, hoping that other people searching for them will be able to come across that name. And it's very simple information. So-and-so survived and is currently in and giving a town. Later on, we'll also have something that I think many of us might know from Israel, radio broadcasts in which lists of names are also read. So there are multiple institutionalized ways that survivors, Polish Jewish survivors in particular, are using in their search for relatives. But the most important aspect, as I mentioned already, of that search, or maybe the most charged one, for not just individuals, but for the community as such, is the fate of Jewish children. Some of them might be too young to know their identity. Some of them might be unsure whether or not it is safe. For some of them, they simply took on completely the identity that was the identity behind which they survived the war. And so both their relatives and the community as such is putting a tremendous effort into seeking and recovering. It's often termed in religious vocabulary as pidyon, as recovering and rescuing Jewish children that are still in the hands of either Christian institutions such as monasteries or families, non-Jewish families that sheltered them during the war. And often these efforts go together. That is, family members are seeking to find out what happened to a child. Often these are no longer the parents of the child, but say an uncle who survived and who knew.
Sorry, all. I'm sure Professor Aleksiun will be back in a moment.
I very much apologize. This is truly a discussion in installments. So as I was saying, an uncle, a cousin might be looking for a child that he only heard or had a notion that this child might have been given to a non-Jewish family for safekeeping. And so both individuals and institutions are seeking the children to return them to families, but also more generally return them to the Jewish community. Here you see an album created by Kerr, one of the most active individuals in a search and recovery of Jewish children after the Holocaust in Poland, with pictures of the children that were found. As I said before, some of these children did not know their names, and they appear in this album as under their Christian names, the names they took on or were given during the war. He was referred to I think I'll give up on the pictures at this point. He had a rank of a captain and would travel in Poland in his uniform, which gave him some gravitas and possibly also some degree of protection to recover, to find, identify, Jewish children back to the community. As I mentioned before, some of these children were not aware of their identity. Therefore, again, Drucker and those that worked with him created albums and catalogs in which children were described, whatever scraps of information they were able to give, to remember about their parents. Sometimes this was just the first name, not the last name, or where they lived before the war and what were the parents, the fathers, the mothers' professions. I want to share with you now one particular story that I think is very indicative and shares some, shine some light on the story of a search for family after the Holocaust. So you see here a picture on the left-hand side, a rescuer, Tadeusz Kobyłko, a Polish Christian man who offered shelter to a Jewish woman in
Natalia,
Lviv,
Natalia, sorry to interrupt.
and who then also, yes.
Natalia, I think you're showing the wrong picture. Ah, thank you.
Am I?
Now it's good.
Hello?
Now it's good.
Okay. There
Now
seems
it's
to
good.
be a delay. So Tadeusz Kobyłko, he rescued a Jewish woman and also her niece. You see this this little girl with a doll standing on the right-hand side, the picture taken still during the war. And the little toddler that Tadeusz is holding by the hand is his own child, a child that was born when he was sheltering this child's mother. So we really don't know. There's no way of knowing to what extent this was a pragmatic relationship, romantic relationship that grew out of a situation of sheltering, and he was risking his life, obviously, when offering to help his partner, his wife, during and after the war. What you see on the computer here is a screenshot of registration that was done in the summer of 1946, when the survivor Faiga, who after the war, after the liberation, did not return to her Jewish identity, did not return to her pre-war name. She stayed with Tadeusz and continued living as his wife, together with the son, Adam, and with her niece, Ita. But the family struggled with economic difficulties. And because of the economic difficulties, it seems that Tadeusz allowed Faiga, allowed the rescued Jewish woman to register at the Jewish community where they were, where they moved after the war. They lived in the territory, part of Poland, Polish territory that became part of the Soviet Union. Lviv became part of the Soviet Union, so they moved west. And when they came west to Bytom, Faiga registered at the Jewish community, at the Jewish committee. And that became a crucial fact that really pretty much decided about her life, about the life of her niece, and the life of her young son. Because of this registration, and interestingly, she registered herself and her niece. She did not register her son. Her family, she had a sister who made Aliyah to Palestine in the 30s. Her family was able to find out that Faiga survived. And that triggered international efforts leading to multiple visits to Faiga's house, contact with emissaries from Palestine, but also emissaries from Jewish community. And in the end, in August of 1946, Faiga leaves Tadeusz, leaves Poland, grabs both children, her son and her niece, and begins a long journey across Europe, through Germany, through Czechoslovakia, then Germany, then France. And in the fall of 1947, still before the creation of the State of Israel, Faiga arrives in Palestine and breaks all contact with her rescuer. Now, this is a complicated story in and of itself, one that we could talk about in terms of gratitude, difficult, complex relationship between relationships between rescued and rescuers. But what's essential for our story here is that decision of registering at the Jewish committee, giving her name and letting the Jewish world know that she is there, ended up allowing her family to find her, even though officially to the outside world, she was living under her assumed name and under assumed identity as a Catholic wife with 2 children. So we have here the search for families that is not only the search for family members among survivors themselves, but also search from the outside for survivors that enables survivors to often leave Eastern Europe and begin a rebuild.
Unmute, yeah, there we go.
This registration card from the DP camps. So we see here a great degree of continuity between the physicality of registration that was first created in Eastern Europe as a way of people letting know among survivors and among family members abroad that they are alive. And that registration continued once they crossed the border and found themselves in DP camps. And that registration continued to play a vital role in searching and finding, in many cases, family members. But aside from those physical cards that are now, for the most part, scanned and are a very interesting and moving resource, I want to mention 2 other physical spaces in which people were searching, or through which people were searching. One are train stations. Paul mentioned, I believe in his introductory remarks, that we have on the one hand survivors that survive under the German occupation through various trajectories of survival, hiding, passing, fighting, work camps, but the vast majority of East European Jewish survivors survived in the Soviet Union, and they are returning to Poland beginning in the spring and summer of 1946. I believe we'll hear more about it later today. But for survivors who are already in Poland, those incoming trains become a constant hope that a relative of theirs might be coming back. So from smaller towns especially, there are many descriptions of people daily going to train station to wait for the arriving repatriation train with the hope of seeing who might show up, who might get off the train, and whether or not they might be reunited. So other than the cards, this is one important venue to think of as a search place. And then one last item I want to mention are the letters. Yad Vashem has a fascinating project of scanning first letters, that is letters written by survivors to family members, often in Eretz Israel, in Palestine, still mandatory Palestine in 1946, 1947, or to America, letting the family members know that here they are alive, and letting these family members know what happened to the family. And these are incredible little chronicles of the Holocaust, written by people really in the first moments after liberation. I was fortunate enough to see a few such letters, and one of the most remarkable stories has to do, for me, with a language. It was a letter written by a 14-year-old survivor who survived alone. His mother was killed very brutally, very close to liberation. He was rescued by Jehovah's Witnesses, by a family that with great risk sheltered him and brought him back to life. And then he returns to his hometown. He knows that nobody from his family is coming back because he witnessed his mother's death and he knew of his father's death. But he knew also he has an uncle in Palestine. And he writes a letter in Polish to the uncle, letting him know. Now, I interviewed the survivor, obviously many years later. What I found fascinating is not just that he wrote this letter, but he himself later on erased the language completely. So he had to have his own letter translated to him when he wanted to see what he wrote as a young boy, trying to contact his family and hoping that they will help him to be reunited. So again, we have those cards, those registration cards, we have newspapers, we have radio, we have train stations, but what decided the most was often coincidence, pure luck of bumping into someone, seeing someone, hearing from someone, some scrap of news. And yet, I think we might have all seen news that are still published every now and then in newspapers about family members reunited for the first time in 70 years. With all those efforts of locating and tracing and searching, people still were not always able to find each other and became separated for decades. And some of these stories only found a happy end, really very much close to our time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia. That was really a great and moving presentation. Thank you so much. And it was like being there when you talked about the train stations and the registration cards. It's very moving. I'd like to now, I believe that we're going to open up the chat. Let me see here.
Yes, the chat is open for questions.
Okay, so if people would like to submit questions, then I'll read them to Natalia.
Please also feel welcome to turn on your video if you wish.
Natalia, while we're waiting for the questions to come in, could you just tell me a little bit more about how Esther Strmer was able to survive? Because I think that's a very interesting story and pretty unique, I think. It's
very unique because for the most part, you do have individuals coming out of hiding or groups of small groups of people, and there is also an age issue. There are very few elderly people who survive in forests in the conditions of winter in Eastern Europe, and very few children. The case of Esther is remarkable because she seems to be extremely savvy in organizing that rescue as a family unit together. She's very much in charge of the operation. And what also is on the side of their luck is that they have friendly foresters that help them find not just a cave, and not once but twice, but a cave that is very strategically chosen, away from places which are frequented. So it really becomes a remarkable story of multi-generational rescue. And she writes that account of survival precisely as a story of a grandmother. And she runs the family unit with an iron fist. I mean, she decides how food is divided. She decides when it's a new moon. She keeps Jewish calendar for everybody. She organizes entertainment. The grandchildren are asked to sing and tell stories and tell Polish poetry that they still remember from school. This is a unique group of people in that sense. And she, I was reading it with a degree of, it's always a methodological difficulty to read stories with a happy end, knowing that this happy end occurred. And she writes, we decided that that the Germans will not have an easy way with us. We decided that we will be there for each other no matter what. But this is not to say that families that did not make it were not determined and were not loyal to one another. So there is always this question of luck in the case of that group. But yes, I wanted to start with her picture, with her family unit picture, because there aren't many post-war, immediate post-war pictures in which you have a grandmother, children, grandchildren, until the repatriation trains from the Soviet Union start arriving. That's when you start seeing more elderly and younger people.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to read now some of the questions. We have a bunch of questions that have come in. So I'm going to read them, and just keep in mind that because there's a bunch of questions, we probably should try to answer them as concisely as possible. Okay. In terms of the letters that you talked about, I guess the ones that are in Yad Vashem, those are in Yad Vashem. There was a question about that. Okay. Registration cards that you mentioned, where are those kept? And is there access online for those cards?
Access is still difficult, but they are physically at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, which inherited the entire archive of the Central Committee of the Jews in Poland. By the way, I will share with you on a personal note that it was very moving for me to find a registration card with my grandmother and my mother inscribed as a child, but also was one of the bad cards without too much information. And I'm not entirely sure if this is because my grandmother didn't insist on filling on all the forms, or simply the clerk was not really into it. But the cards are scanned at the USHMM. They're also at Bad Arolsen at the archives in Germany. So they're now in a few places and can be viewed. The problem is that once these cards are out of Polish linguistic zone, and this is an issue with a lot of the searching online, for example, in a database of Shoah victims in Yad Vashem, is that the names had many spellings and many variations, and you need to be aware of what variations there were. So sometimes the names are simply butchered in the process of being transcribed by a well-meaning student intern. So they are sometimes tricky for searches. And as far as we're talking about names, I will just mention something that might seem obvious, but this is the situation in late 40s, early 50s, when women, upon getting married, did not keep their names. So this is also something that made the search tremendously difficult, because from certain point on, if you were looking for a woman and she married, she became invisible for these searches.
Thank you. Here's a question. I know since you've done work in Western Europe, I think you're actually the right person to answer this, but were there any differences in reunification between Eastern and Western Europe?
This is an excellent question, actually. I think that a lot of the patterns are the same patterns. The question is, what was the degree of destruction? Meaning, if we're talking about the Lithuanian Jewish community, which is destroyed almost entirely, or Polish Jewish community, which 95+% was murdered, the chances for reunification, simply statistically, are much slimmer than, say, when we're talking about French Jewry, especially native French Jewish community, not immigrants who live there. So the scope of reunification, I think, is much smaller when the communities are devastated to greatest degree. But the patterns are similar. For example, the question of recovering Jewish children from monasteries and from the hands of Christian caretakers was just as much an issue in Belgium as it was in Poland. And in fact, where the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Israel was trying to appeal to the Pope to issue statements that would encourage Catholic institutions to release these children to the hands of Jewish organizations. This was not only about Eastern Europe.
Thank you. Here's another question regarding the letters that were sent. Was mail working between the countries considering the lawlessness and violence?
This is, again, a wonderful question. And I was so focusing whether or not the connection is still working or interrupted, that I think I did meant to mention it in my talk. So thank you for giving me a chance. The letters are traveling. The mail is working now. You might be waiting for a long time, and I think that this is why every letter starts, and this is the art of writing and receiving letters that I think I might be the last to still write letters to my parents by hand as growing up. But in those post-war letters, it always started with, I received your letter of this day, so that the person would know what part of the correspondence was received and what was not received. If this is an ongoing correspondence. And once contact was established, then you have letters exchanged across borders. There is not much, I think, of a question of, for example, censorship. This is more an issue of Jewish letters written under the Nazi occupation, what you could write and what you wrote with code language. Now, in the post-war period, it's more a question of how quickly the mail can travel. And not less important is the question of whether the letter will find you. Right? This is a time of tremendous mobility. Not all of this is happy mobility. Jews might be settling in their hometown, and then in a context of violence and threats, might be leaving overnight and moving somewhere else. So it was more an issue of whether the current address was still the current address of a survivor a month later, a week later, and certainly 3 months later. What I found particularly moving are the letters that are half addressed, meaning, and I've seen those envelopes when this is, Miss Chaya Goldberg, Brooklyn. And it somehow made it. And, especially children who might be teenagers in 1945, 46, but they were young children before the war. And conversations about the exact address of uncle in America were not important. But in testimonies, you also have conversations, sort of farewell conversations with parents, in which parents try to inscribe the names and addresses of family members abroad. And if you survive, you should write to aunt, uncle, cousin, etc. So I think that some survivors come out with this urge to contact family members as part of legacy from their parents, not a fully conscious one, possibly.
Okay, thank you. Another question, you had mentioned somebody named Drucker, and I guess he was one of the people who was rescuing children or recovering children after the war. So could you tell us a little bit more about him? And did anybody write his biography?
I don't know of a biography, and he deserves one. He really deserves a biography. So he was from Jordanov. He was of this generation that was raised in a Second Polish Republic. He was trained to be a teacher of Mosaic faith. This is basically Hebrew school teacher, and also studied at Warsaw University and at the Institute of Judaic Studies. He escapes east, as many young men did. This is something that I believe will be discussed by other lecturers, so I don't want to deprive them of their bread. But he survives in the Soviet Union and returns in the uniform of the Polish army, being part of the Red Army. It's a long and complicated story, but among many Jewish refugees in the Soviet Union, they were unable, even if they wanted and tried, to join the Anders army, the army that marched out of the Soviet Union and ended up in Palestine and later on in Italy, but they were able to join the army that formed later under the aegis of the communist leadership. And so Drucker goes all the way to Berlin, fights, and then returns to Poland, where he is mobilized by Rabbi David Kahane, one of the very interesting figures who also deserves a biography of his own, a liberal rabbi from Lviv, Lemberg, who was the chief rabbi of Polish army after the war, chief rabbi of Argentina after he left Poland, and a chief rabbi of Israeli Air Force after he emigrated to Israel. And when I started doing my research many years ago, he was still alive, but I was told that unfortunately his memory was gone, and that there was no point in trying to meet with him. I very much regret it. So Drucker becomes the right-hand man of Kahane, and they are both actively pursuing, with the help of many volunteers, many young women among them. But the fact that Drucker wears the uniform, again, gives him a certain psychological advantage, shall we say, when he knocks on the doors of Polish peasant families and says that, you know, he hears that there is a Jewish child there. And then what happens are often negotiations sometimes that are financial, about reimbursing the cost of upkeeping of the Jewish child, and some children are simply, how should I put it, taken out at night without necessarily the consent of the family. The most heartbreaking are stories, and you know, some of these children are, although they are rescued, they are not treated well. They are often abused, and so this is not just a rescue in terms of returning them to the Jewish community, but also taking them out of very difficult situations. But there are also those stories in which they are loved, especially when they were adopted by childless couples who raised them often from infancy for 2, 3, 4 years. And I actually interviewed many years ago in Israel a man who was an activist in Koordynacja, who was part of the network of people who traveled to find these children. And he told me of one story that tore his heart, that broke his heart, of a woman, a single woman, childless, unmarried woman who rescued a child, loved this boy dearly, and she begged him. She was willing to go with the child to Palestine. She didn't want to part, and the child was taken away from her. So these are not simple stories at all, and the activists of Koordinacja were not seeing these as simple stories either. Drucker did write some about misgivings he did feel at times about what he was doing, but nevertheless the general belief was that these children belong with the Jewish people, and especially if there were family members waiting for them. This was, I think, making the decisions a little easier.
Natalia, thank you so much for the answers, and thank you so much for a great lecture. And I know it was a little bit bumpy here and there, but I think it was worth it. And you know, it's the subject matter is difficult, and you know, we had a little bit of suffering, but not too bad. It was definitely worth it. So thank you so much.
My apologies for the internet. It really, I mean, now I'm sure it will be smooth throughout the day.
You fixed it for us, so we'll be fine now. Thank you.
And if you have any questions, or if you have material, or if I didn't explain something enough in depth, please write to me. Paul and Elizabeth have my email. It's not secret at all.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A virtual applause. Okay.
Thank you.